I think this puppy just solved a mystery the whole town forgot." That was the first thing I said when I picked up the little guy, soaked from the rain and trembling under the porch swing outside my hardware store. He wasn't more than a few months old, shaggy brown fur, muddy white paws, and ears too big for his head. But it wasn't just the puppy that caught my attention. It was what he was wearing. An old, dull medal tied to his collar with a piece of worn leather string. That thing had rust in the grooves, but you could still make out a faint inscription. And that inscription, it was a name the town hadn't spoken in over 30 years. The wind was sharp that morning, blowing the last of the autumn leaves into Main Street, scattering them like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle no one could finish. I crouched down slowly, careful not to spook the puppy. He stared up at me with wide, hopeful eyes, tail thumping once against the wet floorboard. I reached for the medal and brushed away the grime with my thumb. My chest tightened. Private Benjamin T. Ellis. The name rang out in my head like a bell that had gone silent for too long. I hadn't thought of Benny Ellis since I was a teenager. Back then, everyone knew him as the high school quarterback who gave up a scholarship to enlist. He shipped off to Vietnam, wrote letters home, then just stopped writing. The town held a ceremony for him after the war ended, placed his name on a stone in the park, and went back to their routines. Benny was the kind of memory people left on a shelf. But now his name was dangling from a wet puppy's neck. I wrapped the pup in my flannel jacket and carried him inside. The store smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and the heater was still ticking as it fought off the morning chill. I dried the little guy off with an old rag, then poured him a bowl of water and watched him lap it up like he hadn't had a drink in days. "Where on earth did you come from?" I muttered, squinting at the medal again. It was standard issue military, with the Army crest faint but visible. That didn't make any sense. Benny Ellis had no children, no known family. His house had been sold off decades ago and eventually torn down. No one had lived on that side of the lake in years. I called up Tom, the town's unofficial historian and my fishing buddy since high school. Within 20 minutes, he was parked in front of the store, his beat-up Chevy hissing steam in the cold. "Tell me you're kidding," he said, the moment he held the medal. "I wish I was." Tom's face went through a dozen different expressions before settling on a stunned silence. "This is Benny's all right. I remember this thing. He wore it home once, proud as anything. Said it wasn't worth much, but it meant everything." The puppy wandered between us, nuzzling Tom's pant leg and wagging his tail like he was part of the conversation. He was starting to warm up, his eyes brighter now, the fear slowly melting off his tiny shoulders. "You think he could be, I don't know, reincarnated or something?" Tom asked with a chuckle that didn't quite land. "No, but I think someone out there knows something. And I think this pup found his way here for a reason." Tom and I agreed to check the woods near where Benny's old house used to be. We bundled up, threw a flashlight and some jerky in my truck, and took off, the puppy curled in the passenger seat like he'd always belonged there. We parked just off Miller's Road, where the old trails ran down toward the lake. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and fallen leaves. The path was barely visible under layers of moss and branches, but the puppy jumped out of the truck and took off with purpose. "Hey, wait up!" I shouted, stumbling over a root. He led us through the underbrush like a tour guide, darting between trees and hopping over stones until we reached the ruins of Benny's house. The foundation was still there, cracked concrete and patches of moss-covered brick. One of the porch steps still stood, half sunken into the earth. Tom lit his flashlight and swept it across the wreckage. "I haven't been here since we were kids." We followed the pup to the back of the property, where a rusted mailbox lay in the grass. The little guy sniffed around it, then started barking at something under the hedge. Tom knelt and pushed aside the thorns, revealing an old cigar box sealed shut with black tape. "You gotta be kidding me," Tom said. I took the box and peeled back the tape. Inside were a stack of letters, some addressed to Benny's parents, others with no names at all. There was a photo, too. Benny, in uniform, holding a Labrador puppy. They looked just like our little guy. "Oh my Lord," I whispered. "That's him. That's the same dog." "But Benny never came back. So how—" Tom trailed off. We carried the box and the pup back to town, minds racing. The letters inside weren't just notes. They were apologies, confessions, even a few unfinished poems. One of them talked about the dog. He called him Champ, said he found him lost in the jungle during his last patrol, said Champ had a way of finding his way home no matter what. Over the next few days, I shared the story with a few folks around town. The news spread fast. People came by the store just to see the puppy. Some brought treats. Others just wanted to look at the medal. And every time they asked the same question: how did a dog show up, wearing a soldier's medal tied with a string from the past? Nobody knew. But everyone felt something when they looked into those big brown eyes, like the town had been given a second chance at something, like Benny wasn't forgotten, like maybe he was still around, in some small way reminding us all what it meant to come home. I started calling the puppy Champ, too. It just felt right. He stayed with me at the store every day, greeting customers, napping by the heater, chewing on scraps of rope I didn't have the heart to take away. He had that same calming effect Benny used to have. Made people pause, made them smile. Tom's been digging through the archives, trying to piece together Benny's last movements. I've got a few folks saying they remember someone hiking around the lake last month. One woman said she saw a puppy sitting alone near the cemetery, staring at the war memorial. I don't know what to believe, but I know what I feel. That medal wasn't just a keepsake, it was a message, and that puppy didn't wander into town by accident. There's more to this story, and I think Champ is the only one who knows how it ends. By the time the second week rolled around, Champ had become something of a celebrity. People were stopping by the store not just to buy screws or nails, but to see him. Kids brought drawings of him. Miss Cartwright from the diner started bringing scraps, ham, turkey, little strips of bacon, and Champ would sit politely at her feet, tail sweeping slow and steady, like he knew he was earning his place here. But what really got the town buzzing wasn't the dog. It was what Tom found in the county records. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Tom said, pushing open the door of the hardware store with a folder clutched under his arm. He was flushed from the cold, hair sticking out from under his knit cap. I set down the wrench I'd been shelving and raised an eyebrow. "What now?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed copy of a property deed. "This is Benny Ellis's original land deed, the one that includes that old foundation near the lake. But look at this. He added a clause in 74. Says he built a small storage cabin behind the property line. Declared it a private archive. Legally, it's still part of the Ellis estate." "So?" "So," Tom said, flipping to the next page. "It means the county can't touch it. And it's still technically open. No demolition, no sale, nothing. Which means if it's still standing, we can go inside." That same afternoon, we drove back out to the lake, this time with Champ perched between us like a little co-pilot. We parked near the same trailhead and followed him again. But this time, he didn't stop at the old house. He kept going, weaving through the woods like he had a map in his head. 10 minutes later, he came to a stop at a moss-covered shack. It was barely visible through the trees, a lean-to style cabin with a rusted tin roof and a single door, padlocked but weathered. A faded army green tarp fluttered from one side, half torn and stiff from age. "You ever see this before?" I asked Tom. "Never knew it was here. Benny must have been the only one who did." We circled the structure, noting the collapsed back corner and a pile of rotted wood. Champ sniffed along the edge until he found a spot under the window where the ground had softened. He pawed at the dirt like he was trying to dig something up. Tom and I exchanged a look. He nodded, then used a crowbar from my truck to pop the old lock. The door creaked open, and the musty air that hit us smelled like old paper and cedar. Inside were rows of milk crates filled with notebooks, photographs, and envelopes, some sealed, some opened. Along the back wall, a canvas-covered pinboard displayed a collection of maps, troop deployment charts, and even some dog tags pinned with red string. "This is like a time capsule," Tom whispered. "Benny must have kept everything." I moved slowly, not wanting to disturb anything. In the center was a small crate with a folded flag on top. Beside it was a leather-bound journal. I picked it up and flipped through. The entries were dated from 1972 to 1974. Benny wrote about patrols, about the jungle, about the fear of not coming home. But there were also entries about Champ. "He saved my life twice," one entry read. "The first time he dragged me from a minefield. The second, he stood between me and a sniper. Took a bullet through the shoulder. Never left my side after that. When the war ended, I snuck him on the plane. They never knew." I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking. I looked down at Champ, who sat beside me, watching quietly, almost like he understood. Tom had wandered over to the pinboard. "Look at this," he said, pointing at a series of marked locations. "These aren't just troop maps. He was tracking something. Maybe a unit, a patrol route? Or maybe he was trying to piece something together," I said. "Something that didn't sit right." We boxed up the most intact items and brought them back to town. Tom planned to digitize them with the help of his nephew over at the library. I took the journal home and read it cover to cover that night. The more I read, the more I realized Benny had been onto something. He mentioned names, men in his squad who went missing, and others who returned but never talked. There were hints of a cover-up, mentions of a coded message, something Benny thought Champ had been trained to retrieve. But the strangest entry of all came near the end. "If Champ ever finds his way back," it read, "he'll be looking for what I left behind. And maybe, just maybe, someone will be listening this time." That next morning, I brought Champ to the war memorial downtown. He walked slowly, sniffing at each plaque like he was searching. When he reached Benny's name, he sat down and stayed there for a full 5 minutes, silent and still. Word got around, of course. The whole town wanted to know what the journal said. Tom hosted a small event at the library, displaying scanned letters and photos. People cried. Some brought old keepsakes, dog tags of their own, faded photographs from the 70s. One man even remembered seeing Champ as a boy. Said a soldier had visited his farm after the war with a dog just like him. Gave him a salute and walked off toward the woods. I started to wonder if Champ was more than just a namesake. He had habits. He'd walk the perimeter of my property every night before bed. He'd respond to sharp whistles and crouch low like a scout in training. It was like some part of that history had carried forward. Tom and I kept digging. The coded message Benny referred to, turned out to be a string of letters hidden in the corners of his journal pages. When we pieced them together, they spelled, "Check Oak Tree Base." Back we went. Near the old cabin stood a massive oak, its trunk as wide as a small car. We searched around the roots, and sure enough, beneath a pile of stones, we found a sealed tin tube. Inside was a single microfilm reel. Neither of us had a working reader, so we took it to the high school. Mrs. Hanover, the history teacher, had an old projector in her classroom. She stayed late, curious as ever, and threaded the reel through. What we saw made our jaws drop. It was a video clip, grainy and silent, showing a young Benny Ellis crouched beside Champ in what looked like a jungle clearing. He was holding a small box and pointing at something off-screen, then pulling out a map and writing something. Then he looked directly into the camera, and though there was no sound, you could read his lips clearly. "If this is ever found, tell them the dog remembered." The room was so quiet, you could hear the film spool clicking. I glanced down at Champ. He was lying at my feet, eyes half closed, tail twitching just slightly. That night, I dreamed of the jungle. Not in a scary way, but in the way old soldiers talk about it. The colors, the sounds, the sense that something important was always just out of reach. The next morning, I got a letter from the local VFW. They wanted to recognize Champ at the upcoming Veterans Day parade. Said his story meant something big. I agreed, of course, but I asked that we also talk about Benny, the man who risked everything, who trusted a dog with the truth. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. There was still something missing. A piece Champ was leading us toward. Something more than old letters and medals. And until we found it, I wasn't letting him out of my sight. The week leading up to Veterans Day felt like the whole town was moving in slow motion. There was a hum in the air, a shared feeling that something bigger than all of us was about to be acknowledged. Flags went up on porches that hadn't flown one in years. A group of high schoolers painted signs that read, "Welcome home, Champ," and taped them across storefronts. Miss Cartwright made cookies shaped like little paw prints. Even the mayor called and asked if Champ could ride on the lead float in the parade. But Champ didn't care much about parades. He had a mission. Every morning just after sunrise, he would nudge me awake, tail flicking lightly, and lead me to a new part of town. First it was the train depot, long closed down but still standing like a forgotten chapter. Then the edge of the cemetery, where he sniffed at the stones like they held some memory he couldn't quite reach. Then to the water tower, and the burned-out remains of the Ellis barn. Each time, he acted with purpose, and each time, he would sit quietly for a few minutes before turning back, satisfied for reasons I couldn't understand. One morning, I asked Tom if he'd ever heard of dogs being used to retrace old routes. He said search dogs could do it, even decades later, if the memory had been strong enough. But this wasn't scent work. This felt like instinct. That Friday, 2 days before the parade, I took Champ for a walk around the block before opening the store. It was cold, the kind of morning that turned your breath into smoke and made every step crunch beneath the frost. Champ sniffed around the post office steps, then stopped in front of the alley between the bakery and the antique shop. He stood perfectly still. I followed his gaze. There, propped against the brick wall, was a wooden crate I hadn't noticed before. It looked out of place. Too clean, too deliberate. On top of it sat an envelope. My name written in block letters. I looked around. The alley was empty. Hands trembling, I opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of Benny and Champ, same one we'd seen before, but on the back, in blue ink, were coordinates. "Tom," I said over the phone 10 minutes later, "I think someone else knows." We met back at the library with the photograph. Tom ran the coordinates through a map search. "That's up in the foothills," he said, "near the old firewatch station. You remember that cabin up there? Used to be manned year-round, then they automated it." Benny mentioned the station in his journal once, said it had a clear view of the whole valley. The next morning, we drove up the trailhead, this time with boots, supplies, and thermoses of black coffee. Champ bounced in the back seat, nose pressed to the window. He knew. Somehow, he knew. The path was steep, the leaves slick from the thaw. Halfway up, the wind picked up and the trees swayed like giants whispering to each other. Champ didn't hesitate. He moved with purpose, just like he had before. The firewatch station sat on a hill overlooking the town, a squat wooden structure with metal shutters and an old antenna that pointed toward the sky like a finger. The place had been locked up, but the chain around the door had already been cut. Inside, everything was still. Dust motes floated in the light. A desk sat in the center, and on it, another envelope. This one didn't have a name, just a single word: truth. We opened it. Inside were several typed pages, stapled together. A story, written in the first person. Benny's words. He talked about an operation that never made it into the records. A mission gone sideways. Orders that didn't match the mission brief. He and his unit had stumbled onto something. Civilian captives held in the jungle. No reason given. Benny disobeyed orders and tried to extract them. He got a few out. The rest were lost. Champ had been with him. Trained, yes. But more than that, he was Benny's conscience in the jungle. A tether to what was right. One line caught my eye. "I buried the files. Not for me, for the future. If anyone ever wants to know what happened, they'll have to trust the dog." The last page had another set of coordinates. Tom looked at me. "You think he's leading us to the captives? Or the proof they existed?" We hiked further north that day, past the fire station, through pine and snow-dusted rocks. The new location was a cave, barely visible from the path. Champ walked right up to it and sat, wagging his tail. Inside, under a loose pile of rocks, we found a locked metal box. Inside were film reels, cassette tapes, and photographs. Some labeled with dates, some with names. We drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller listened as we told him everything. Then he examined the contents with gloves and a magnifying glass. When he was done, he leaned back and let out a long breath. This is a full military op log. Prisoners, call signs, transcripts. Looks like Benny was keeping track of a rogue element. These men weren't just soldiers. They were operating outside the chain of command. And Benny tried to expose it. The sheriff nodded. And no one listened. Until now. The sheriff promised to contact the Department of Defense. He said this would go to the right hands. Said it might be messy, might take time, but truth had a way of surfacing. That night, as I sat on my porch with Champ lying at my feet, I couldn't help but feel something shifting. Like the town was finally waking up. Like maybe this dog had changed something none of us could have on our own. At the parade, Champ sat proudly on the front float, surrounded by local veterans. When his name was announced, the crowd clapped and whistled. and when they mentioned Benny Ellis, a hush fell over Main Street. Then one old man, someone I didn't recognize, stepped forward and saluted the float. Said, "Welcome home, soldier." Champ didn't bark or move. He just lifted his head, eyes locked on the man, and gave one solemn wag of his tail. The wind picked up. Somewhere, someone started singing the anthem. But I wasn't focused on the song. I was watching Champ, watching the way he looked toward the hills, toward the cave, toward everything we still didn't understand. There were more pages in Benny's journal. We hadn't even read them all. And I had a feeling this story had just begun. 2 mornings after the parade, just before dawn, Champ woke me again. Same gentle nudge to the side of my bed, same quiet gaze. No barking. He'd never been a noisy dog. That was part of his mystery. He didn't demand attention. He directed it. I threw on my coat, boots, and hat, and followed him outside. The air had that edge of winter in it, the kind that makes your breath hang heavy and your joints stiff. Champ led me away from the house, not toward town, not to the lake or the fire station, but across the northern ridge, past the frost-cracked pavement where old Cedar Road used to run. We walked for nearly 30 minutes in silence, our only company the hush of the wind and the crunch beneath our soles and paws. Then he stopped. It was a clearing I hadn't seen in years, the kind where trees grew in a circle, perfectly spaced, like nature had planned it that way. In the center stood an old oak stump, split low, almost like a bench. Champ jumped up and sat there, waiting. In front of the stump was a small, flat rock. Nothing about it seemed important until I stepped closer and saw the tiny initials carved in its edge, B.E., and under it, barely visible, for what they never saw. I dropped to my knees, ran my fingers across the grooves. This wasn't new. This had been here for decades, slowly worn down by weather and time. Champ looked at me, then shifted his gaze to the trees behind me. I turned around. There, nestled at the base of a tree, was another envelope. This one was damp at the edges, but sealed with care. Inside were 6 photographs and a note. The photos were grainy, but unmistakable. Military personnel in non-standard uniforms, armed near what looked like a makeshift camp. One image showed shackles. Another, a crate with foreign symbols. A date stamped the corner. March 17th, 1974. The note was short. They said it wasn't my place to question, but it became my place the moment I saw them hurt innocents. These photos are the only proof I could get. I've hidden the rest where no man would think to look. Only a loyal friend could lead the way. There was no name, but the handwriting matched Benny's journal. I stared at Champ. "You're leading us to what Benny never finished." Tom met me later that day with a scanner, and we digitized the photos. He was quiet for a long time after seeing them. I think Benny discovered something he wasn't supposed to, and he buried it the only way he could, through this dog. We spent the afternoon combing through the remaining journal pages. Most were notes, fragmented thoughts, but one passage stood out. I trained Champ to understand paths, not just where we've been, but where we're going. If they ever want the truth, they need to walk where we walked. Tom read it aloud, then looked up. What if he means literally retracing the mission? Then we need to find the original patrol route. All of it. With help from old maps in the library and a few grainy entries from the journal, we began recreating the patrol from Benny's last tour. Champ followed along every outing, nose to the ground, eyes sharp. He moved like a guide, pausing only when we stopped to read or cross-reference. One site matched a clearing near Ridgeline Bluff. It had been used during the Cold War as a remote training ground. According to old blueprints, there were tunnels nearby. The entrance was hidden behind a boulder. Champ led us right to it. We never would have noticed it without him. Just a patch of ivy and leaves, a trick of the terrain. Beneath it, a narrow metal hatch. It took us half an hour to clear the debris. When we finally pried it open, a gust of stale air hissed out like a sigh from the past. The tunnel sloped downward into darkness. We brought lanterns, extra batteries, and thick gloves. Champ stayed close, never straying. The floor was dry, lined with old boards. About 20 feet in, we found it, a hidden room. Inside were sealed ammo cans, a rusted locker, and 3 crates marked with stenciled numbers. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. We pried open the first crate. Inside, documents wrapped in plastic, carefully labeled. Operation names we didn't recognize. One folder contained medical reports, handwritten notes describing injuries inconsistent with any training exercise. Another crate held recording equipment, tapes, reels, photos, and something that looked like a military-issued body camera. It was all still there. We cataloged everything and called Sheriff Miller again. When he arrived and saw the extent of it, he turned pale. "You realize what this means? This isn't just old records. This is evidence, real evidence." He made a call that night to a federal contact in Richmond, told us to lock the place up and stay quiet until they sent someone. Back in town, things were tense. Word hadn't gotten out, but people sensed something. Miss Cartwright said Champ had become her daily therapy. The mayor wanted a town hall to honor Benny's legacy. A retired colonel showed up from the next county and asked to see the medal. Everywhere we went, people talked about truth, about legacy, about loyalty. And still, Champ walked. Every day, he'd pick a new route. Some led to old schools, others to the fairgrounds or the fields near Miller's Creek. He seemed to be saying, "Remember this. Remember all of it." That weekend, the Department of Defense sent 2 agents. They were respectful, methodical, and visibly stunned by what they saw. One of them shook my hand and said, "You may have just solved a 40-year cover-up." Champ sat beside him the entire time, calm and alert. They collected the records, photographed everything, and promised updates. But I knew better than to expect headlines. Some stories aren't for front pages. Some are quiet truths that need to be held and passed on. At the library, Tom set up a display with Benny's photo and a plaque that read, "Truth has many trails. Some have paws." People came by to see it. Left flowers, letters, tokens of their own service. A boy placed his father's old ribbon next to the medal. I watched Champ one evening lying under the display, eyes half closed. And I wondered, how much of this did he truly understand? Or maybe understanding didn't matter. Maybe it was the doing, the walking, the showing us what we couldn't see on our own. One thing was clear. There was more to find. And Champ wasn't finished yet. The first snowfall of the season came early. Thick flakes danced down in slow spirals, turning the sidewalks white and blanketing the tops of cars like powdered sugar. By the time I got to the store that morning, Champ had already claimed his usual spot on the front rug, head on his paws, watching people shuffle by. It was strange how natural it had become, this quiet companionship between us. There were no leashes, no commands, just shared looks and paths walked side by side. like we both knew this was bigger than errands or routines. Tom showed up just before noon, his coat dusted with snow, cheeks red from the cold. He didn't speak right away, just held up an envelope with no postmark. "Found it tucked under the door of the library this morning," he said. "You need to read this." We sat in the back room, the heater humming softly. Champ curled beside my chair as I unfolded the letter. It wasn't signed, just a typed note, clear and simple. Benny wasn't alone. There were others who tried to speak. One of them kept a copy. It's still here, but it was hidden after the first man disappeared. Follow the lines of sight. Look where the guard always looked. Tom leaned back, frowning. It's like a puzzle, a message within a message. Lines of sight, I murmured. That has to mean the fire station, the one overlooking the valley. I thought we checked that place top to bottom. We looked inside, but what about the tower itself? Where they used to stand, look out over the trees. That afternoon, we made the climb again. Champ led, weaving through the snow without hesitation. The trail was harder now, covered in fresh powder. But he stayed focused. At the top, the station looked the same. Quiet, unmoving. We circled the outer platform. Nothing obvious stood out. Then Champ stopped. His head tilted. He took a few slow steps forward and sat directly in front of the northeast railing. I followed his gaze. The view from there stretched all the way across the valley. Just trees, hills, the tops of some barns and rooftops far in the distance. But then I saw it. One tree, perfectly centered in the line of sight. A single pine, taller than the rest, with a crooked top that looked like a hook. Tom pulled out the map. That's near the old train tracks, the ones they shut down back in the 80s. You think something's buried there? There's only one way to find out. It took us an hour to hike back down, and another to reach the tracks. By then, the snow had slowed to a gentle drift. The pine tree stood just off the rail line, exactly where we thought it would be. Champ ran ahead, nose to the ground, then started pawing near the base of the trunk. We dug with gloved hands and a small shovel. It wasn't long before we struck something hard. A weatherproof box, smaller than the last. Inside, wrapped in a sealed pouch, was a bundle of documents, typed transcripts, maps, and a photograph. The photograph showed 6 men, none of whom we recognized. But the uniforms, the gear, they were the same as in Benny's photos. One man in the middle had a black patch over his eye. The others had name tags, partially obscured. On the back, Camp Reliant, July 1974, Mission 17 Delta. We took everything back to Tom's office at the library and started piecing it together. The transcripts were internal communications, apparently intercepted and copied by someone on the inside. They mentioned prisoners, transfers, silencing threats. One message stood out. Contain Ellis. If the dog becomes a problem, remove it. Tom read it twice. They tried to silence him, and they knew about Champ. It made sense now why Benny had hidden everything the way he did. Why he trained the dog to remember. If you couldn't trust people, you trusted loyalty. And Champ, whether it was the original or something passed on, had followed through. We brought the new evidence to Sheriff Miller. This time, he didn't even blink. He called the federal team directly. They arrived 2 days later, this time with more gear, more agents. Quiet, serious types. They combed through every document, every map. One of them asked to walk the trail with Champ. He returned an hour later, eyes wet. I don't know how, he said. But this dog remembers. The government didn't try to hush it up. Instead, they took it seriously. They said Benny's findings would be preserved, reviewed, and added to the archives. They also said Champ had played a critical role in a delayed act of military truth-telling. The phrase felt strange, but it fit. Still, there were parts of the story that didn't add up. In one of Benny's earliest letters, he wrote about a signal. Something buried. Something he was told to ignore. The journal never said where. That night, I walked out to the porch with Champ. The stars were bright, and the cold was sharp. He sat beside me, head resting on my knee. "You're not done, are you?" I whispered. The next morning, we followed him again. This time he led us south, toward the marshlands, where no one went anymore. The ground was soft, and water pooled around our boots, but Champ moved like he was tracing a memory. Near a collapsed bridge, he stopped. There was no plaque, no marker, just a broken stone set into the ground, almost completely covered by grass. We dug, and under the stone, wrapped in waterproof fabric, was a small, rusted transmitter. Still intact, still functional. Tom ran a scan at the station. The frequency was military, active. It matched a ping from the old records, the signal Benny had mentioned. Only now, the government agents took it seriously. They launched a follow-up investigation, said it might lead to more buried communications, perhaps even other camps. We didn't press for details. We didn't need to. The truth was moving again. Champ had made sure of it, and I had no doubt he'd keep leading us until every part of Benny's message had been delivered. It was sometime just after Christmas when we first noticed Champ starting to slow down. Not in a way that worried us at first. He was still eager for walks, still met everyone at the door with his usual thump of the tail and those soft eyes. But the bounce in his step had settled into something quieter, more thoughtful. Tom said maybe he was just getting older, that maybe the miles were starting to show. But I wasn't so sure. Champ didn't act tired. He acted watchful, like he was waiting for something. Meanwhile, the investigation from the Department of Defense had escalated into something bigger than we'd expected. They confirmed the signal from the transmitter Champ had led us to had originally been tied to a clandestine communication network. Their people spent weeks mapping out the old lines, combing through declassified records, and piecing together what Benny had left behind. Word came that more teams would be visiting the area soon, looking into satellite footage from decades ago and cross-referencing troop locations with Benny's map. But in the middle of all that, Champ had turned his attention elsewhere. One morning, just after New Year's, I opened the shop late and found him waiting at the back door instead of the front. He paced once, gave a soft bark, and trotted toward the alley beside the bakery. I followed him out of habit, though I had a stack of invoices waiting. He led me around the back of the bakery, down a gravel lane that passed behind old sheds and tool shacks, until we came to a short wire fence that bordered the abandoned orchard on McCready's land. The trees there had been untended for years, their limbs crooked and wild, apples left to rot each season. Champ sat down right at the fence line and looked up at one particular tree. It was thicker than the others, with bark that curled like paper. I climbed over the fence without asking why. By now, I'd stopped questioning him. Buried near the roots was a tin cylinder. Inside, I found a cassette tape wrapped in wax paper. The label had faded, but the number 3 was still clear. Back at the shop, I dusted off my old tape player and popped it in. The recording was grainy, static, scratching at the edges, but Benny's voice came through. "This is the third of 5, he said. "If you've found this, it means Champ is still doing his job. There are things I couldn't put on paper, people I couldn't name, but I knew they'd try to bury what we saw. So I'm leaving this where only someone who listens to the dog will find it." He went on to describe a nighttime extraction operation in Laos that went wrong. He talked about intercepted orders, conflicting commands, and a quiet warning from a superior who told him, off the record, to disappear or be disappeared. It was all spoken without fear, like Benny had come to peace with it. But at the end, his voice shifted. "If you're listening to this," he said, "know that truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's buried deep, wrapped in mud and silence. But if you keep digging, you'll find it." Tom and I stood there for a long while after the tape ended. Then Champ looked at us like, "Well, what's next?" That afternoon we returned to the orchard and started searching for more canisters. We found 2 more before sundown, each with a cassette labeled in the same way. And 4. We were missing 2 and 5. Tape 1 was a confession. Benny talking about his decision to go against orders, to falsify his final patrol report so he could save 2 captured civilians he believed were wrongly accused of espionage. He never named them. Said their identities didn't matter as much as what they represented. People caught in the machinery. Tape 4 was different. It was a message directly to Champ. "Good boy," Benny's voice said, soft and clear. "If you're hearing this, you did it. You found someone who could help finish what I started. I never expected forgiveness. Just hope." That night, I sat on my porch, the wind biting at my sleeves, Champ curled beside me like always. I looked down at him. "There's more, isn't there?" His ears twitched, and he shifted his head onto my foot like a weight. The next morning, he was waiting again, this time by the path that led to the high school football field. No one had practiced on that field in years. The school had gotten a new stadium built closer to the highway, and this place had been left behind, slowly swallowed by weeds and weather. The bleachers were rusting. The scoreboard no longer worked. But Champ walked across the field like it still mattered. He stopped at the 50-yard line, sniffed once, and then began pawing at the dirt. It didn't take long. Just under the surface was the last canister. Tape 2. It was the shortest one. Just 3 minutes long. "This is where I realized I had no way out," Benny said. "This field, this town, I left pieces of myself here. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. But if Champ makes it back, he'll know where to stand. He'll know where the lie began." And that was it. Tom and I stood on that field long after the tape ended, not quite understanding the meaning, but feeling the weight of it. Back at the library, we began compiling everything. Scanned tapes, transcripts, photos, and we built a timeline that was starting to make sense. Benny's mission, his defiance, the silence that followed. The government agents had been in contact, requesting updates, but I didn't send the last 2 tapes right away. Not yet. They needed to be heard by the people who lived here first. So we set up a quiet exhibit. Not flashy, not publicized beyond a few notices. Just a listening station, some photos, Champ's story. And people came. Old classmates of Benny's, local veterans. A mother who remembered when Benny helped carry groceries to her car back in '69. They listened to the tapes. They sat with Champ. And they remembered. But Champ wasn't done. 3 days after the final tape surfaced, he led me back to the cemetery. It was snowing again, soft flakes settling on the gravestones. He stopped in front of Benny's memorial and sat. That was when I realized something. There was no grave, only a marker. No body ever returned, no confirmed resting place. "Is that what you've been trying to show us?" I asked. Champ stood up, circled once, and lay back down at the base of the stone. I pulled out my phone and called Tom. "I think we need to ask the government one more question." The next week, we received confirmation that Benny Ellis was never officially listed as killed in action. His file simply ended. No further movement, no repatriation, no remains. The final mystery. And Champ, quiet as ever, was still watching the horizon. By the second week of January, the snow had turned thick and wet, the kind that draped heavy over branches and soaked through your boots if you weren't careful. Main Street was quieter than usual, with the holidays over and folks settling back into the rhythm of the long winter ahead. But for me and Champ, the rhythm never slowed. We spent our mornings walking the old routes. He moved slower than before, but with the same silent intent, pausing every so often like he was taking mental notes. If there was more to find, he hadn't let up. The town had started to feel it too. People weren't just curious anymore. They were invested. Miss Cartwright put a photo of Champ beside the register at the diner. Kids in the elementary school wrote letters addressed to the hero dog. Even the town council passed a motion to have a small plaque made for the library's front lawn, for the truth that walked on 4 paws. But behind all the kindness and warmth, something was shifting beneath the surface. Something tied to the final tapes, the unanswered question about Benny's disappearance, and the missing conclusion to the story. I got a call one night from a man who introduced himself only as Walter. Said he'd served with Benny once, briefly, on a stateside rotation, before Vietnam. Said he'd heard about the dog and the tapes through an old contact in Veterans Affairs. "Benny told me once," Walter said, voice low, "that if anything ever happened to him, he'd leave a trail that only one person could follow." I thought he was joking. But maybe he wasn't. He said he'd be coming to town, wanted to see Champ for himself. When he arrived 2 days later, I wasn't sure what to expect. He was tall, thin, with a face like a canyon. Lined, worn, weathered by time and distance. He didn't talk much, just knelt in front of Champ, ran a hand gently over his head, and nodded to himself. "He remembers," Walter said. "Maybe not like we do, but he remembers." We brought him up to speed, showed him the timeline, the tapes, the letters. He read them all quietly, then sat by the fire for a long while before speaking. "I know why there's no grave," he said finally. "I think I know where Benny went." He pulled a folded map from his coat. It was old, creased, yellowed, the kind soldiers used when GPS wasn't a thing. He pointed to a stretch of forest northwest of town. "There's a cabin out there, off-grid. We built it together, before the war. It was going to be a retreat. After everything went sideways, I never went back. But Benny might have." I looked at Champ. He was already standing. It took the better part of the morning to reach the place. We had to park at a ranger trail and hike the rest. 5 miles through deep snow, fallen logs, and terrain that hadn't seen boots in years. Walter moved slower than I expected, but didn't complain once. Champ led the whole way. When we broke through the tree line, there it was. A small cabin tucked between 2 large oaks, the roof caved in slightly on one side, the windows dusted with ice. It didn't look abandoned exactly, just waiting. We approached slowly. The door was closed but unlocked. Inside, the air was stale and cold, but the place was intact. Books on the shelves, blankets folded neatly in the corner, a stove with stacked wood beside it. On the table was a notebook. Walter picked it up with shaking hands. The first page had Benny's handwriting. If someone finds this, then I did the right thing. I couldn't go back. Not with what I knew. But maybe, just maybe, the dog would know where to go. Walter sat down hard in the nearest chair, breathing fast. He turned page after page, tears starting to slip silently down his face. "It's him," he whispered. "It's really him." There were entries dated through the late 70s, notes about isolation, about guilt, about hope, mentions of Champ, training his line, keeping the instinct alive. There were sketches, maps, observations about the forest, and even poems. Benny had lived here, alone, for years. And then the entries stopped. The last was from 1984. "Champ is gone, buried near the South Ridge. He was the best friend I ever had. I don't know how much longer I have. If another dog comes, and someone follows, then maybe I didn't vanish. Maybe I was just waiting." We buried Walter's discovery under silence. No one said anything for a long while. Champ lay near the hearth, as if he'd known this place all along. On the South Ridge, just beyond the tree line, we found the grave. A small wooden cross, half eaten by moss. Faintly scratched into the wood. Champ Ein. I knelt there, brushing away snow. The air was heavy, but not sad. More like reverent. Like we'd reached a sacred place in a story only a few had ever known. Back in town, we didn't tell many people about the cabin. Just the sheriff, the historians helping the government team, and a few close neighbors. We brought Benny's notebook to the library for preservation, and Walter decided to stay in town for a while. He started coming to the store each morning just to sit with Champ. Sometimes they'd walk together. Sometimes they'd just sit. It was like old wounds were knitting together without words. Champ seemed calmer after that. Still watchful, still leading when the moment called. But more at peace. We hadn't reached the end. That much I knew. But for the first time, it felt like we'd reached the heart of it. And still, every morning, Champ would wake me. Still, he'd find new trails, as if somewhere, in the snow and silence, Benny was still whispering directions. The day after we found the cabin, the sun finally broke through the cloud cover for the first time in weeks. It wasn't warm by any means. Still January, still bitter. But the light cast long shadows and turned the snow into something that shimmered. Champ stretched out under the front window of the store like he always did, blinking at the sun like it was a novelty. I kept looking out the window too, watching the street, watching him. Everything around town seemed quieter again, but in a new kind of way. Not empty, just contemplative. People walked a little slower. They stopped to greet Champ even if they were in a hurry. That dog had done something to all of us, something we didn't quite have words for. Around mid-morning, Walter stopped by the store with something wrapped in a towel. It was a set of dog tags. Benny's. "Found them in the lining of an old pack at the cabin," he said. "Thought you should have them for now. Or maybe he should." I looked at Champ, who hadn't moved from his spot in the sunlight. I walked over, knelt beside him, and held out the tags. He sniffed them, blinked once, then pressed his nose to them before resting his head again. I hung them on a small hook above the counter, where they clinked softly every time the door opened. That same afternoon, I got a call from the agent leading the Department of Defense team. They'd traced several of the old operations Benny had mentioned in his notes and confirmed their classified nature. The internal review had triggered a full-scale archival release request, meaning everything Benny had tried to expose might soon be officially acknowledged. "What you found," the agent said, "wasn't just a series of buried items. It was a record, a testament. and it may end up reshaping how we talk about that era." He thanked me again, then asked me if the dog was still healthy. "He's still leading us," I said. "Every day." That evening, Tom and I met Walter at the library to go over the last of the journal entries. We had digitized every page, cross-referenced every map, and archived the audio recordings. But there was one more section we hadn't fully explored yet: Benny's poetry. Most of it was scattered through the pages, little thoughts scribbled in margins, but some were full verses, centered and dated. There was one entry titled, "Return." It read, "I sent you home in silence, with ashes on your paws, a whisper buried deeper than the fight that earned applause. But if the trail reopens, if the lantern still burns low, then walk them past the ruins and show them what you know." Tom was quiet a long time after reading it. Then he looked at me and said, "We need to go back to the original site, the place where it all started." He meant Benny's foundation, the old house ruins near the lake, the place where we first found the cigar box and the photo of the first Champ. We waited for a clear morning, bundled up, packed shovels and lanterns, and followed Champ back to that familiar path. When we arrived, the ruins looked untouched, the snow forming perfect outlines of where the walls used to stand. Champ walked straight through the center, nose to the ground, then stopped at the corner of the porch. We dug carefully. This time, beneath the frost-hardened soil, we hit something metallic. It was a box, but different from the others, larger, painted army green, with reinforced corners and a faded label stamped across the lid. Property of B.T. Ellis. Inside were dozens of smaller envelopes, each labeled with a name. Some had years written beneath the names, ranging from 1972 to 1981. At the bottom of the box was a sealed letter addressed, "To those who found the dog." We opened it together. "By the time you read this," it began, "I'll be long gone. Not because I gave up, but because I had to disappear to let the story live. The dog is not just a pet. He is a messenger. He carries what I couldn't. And those names above? They are the ones who helped. Some knowingly. Some without understanding why. Their stories matter too." He went on to describe a quiet network of people. Neighbors, old classmates, a librarian in another state, who helped hide the documents, preserve information, and quietly push back against the silence that had tried to smother the truth. One name on the envelopes caught my eye. Harold T. Mills. He'd been the high school janitor when I was a kid. Always kept to himself. Passed away a few years ago. We opened his envelope. Inside was a photograph of Benny and Harold, sitting on a tailgate, arms slung over shoulders. On the back, it read, "Told me to keep walking, even when I couldn't." It hit me then just how many people Benny had quietly touched. We returned to town with the box and made a plan to scan and preserve every envelope's contents. The library set up a locked display case and hired a local historian to document the full narrative. People started coming by more often. Older residents who remembered Benny, who had fragments of memories they now realized had meaning. A retired mailman came in and told us Benny used to leave letters in his mailbox with no address, just instructions to drop them in specific places. It was as if the entire town had been part of the puzzle without even knowing. And through it all, Champ stayed steady. Every day, he'd pick a route. Some led to nothing, some led to memories. One morning, he took me to the back of the churchyard, where a tree stump marked the edge of the original town border. There, carved faintly in the wood, was a date, 1975. We found a small stone hidden inside the hollow, etched with the initials CE. I still don't know who CE was, but I trust that Benny did. Walter began writing letters to Benny's surviving military contacts. He wanted them to know the truth had surfaced, that someone had finished what their friend started. One day he told me, "You don't realize how heavy silence can be until it lifts." He said that while scratching behind Champ's ear, the dog letting out a sigh like he agreed. We weren't done. Not yet. But we were finally walking the full trail, and Champ was still leading the way. It was late January when a letter arrived with no return address and only one line of writing on the envelope. For the one following the dog, I found it slipped under the shop's front door one morning, half buried in melting snow, the paper warped but intact. I brought it inside, placed it next to the heater, and waited until it dried enough to open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. Precise. If the truth matters, follow the bend in the river, past the split oak, 1 mile east, where the land forgot the name. That was all it said. No signature, no indication of who sent it. I showed it to Tom, who narrowed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That sounds like someone trying to get us lost. Or like someone who's still playing by Benny's rules. We decided to go that weekend. Walter agreed to join us. He'd grown even closer to Champ, almost like they shared something unsaid between them. Maybe they did. Sometimes Champ would just sit near him and stare into the distance, like they were remembering the same thing from different lifetimes. The river they meant was the Lockridge Fork, a winding stretch of water that curved through dense woods on the east edge of the county. It hadn't been part of any of Benny's mapped operations, but there was something about it, untouched, forgotten, that seemed to fit. We set out early Saturday morning. Champ walked ahead like always, nose low, tail straight, silent. We found the split oak easily. It stood like a broken gate, 2 trunks rising from a common base. From there, we veered east, stepping over roots and through old snow crusted with ice. Nearly an hour passed before Champ stopped. We were in a clearing we hadn't seen on the maps. Wide, sun-drenched, surrounded by pine and ash. At its center stood an old stone marker, half-tipped, covered in lichen. Carved into it were the letters B.E. 1971. We stood in silence. Walter spoke first. This was before he enlisted. We circled the marker. Just behind it was another tin box sealed with wax. Inside was a faded photograph, a small dog collar, and a single cassette. This tape didn't have a number, just a label written in ink that had faded over the years. Listen when ready. We took it back to town. Tom digitized it immediately. The voice that emerged was Benny's, but different, less guarded, more personal. If you're hearing this, it means the trail was walked completely, that the pieces found their way back. I don't know who you are or how far you've come, but I thank you. What was buried didn't need to stay hidden. Truth is never meant to rot. It's meant to grow. And sometimes it takes a long winter to bring it back. Champ was never just a dog. He was the bearer of memory. His line was trained to carry not just scent, but purpose. If you've followed him, then you understand. This land holds echoes, and every step you took helped stir them awake. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then, there are still names that need peace, still questions I couldn't answer, but I hope, somehow, you can. or at least remind people why we ask. The tape ended without fanfare. No goodbye, just static. Afterward, Walter looked at Champ and said, he always knew it wouldn't be him finishing the story. We decided to return the items from the box to the memorial display at the library. The dog collar was placed beside the medal, the tape archived next to the journal entries. People came to see it every day now. Some left notes, others just sat for a while. One boy, maybe 10 years old, came in with his grandfather. He asked if Champ was a soldier. His grandfather knelt beside him and said, no, he was the one who helped the soldier come home. Champ had started sleeping more. Not in a worrying way, just deeper, longer. Sometimes I'd find him lying in the sun, paws twitching like he was dreaming of trails we hadn't found yet. But each time I opened the door in the morning, he was there, waiting, tail tapping, eyes bright. The town council voted to name the old walking trail near the lake after Benny. They called it the Champ Path, though, because they all agreed it was the dog who made the difference. Tom's nephew, who'd been helping digitize all the records, created a website to host the full archive. It included timelines, scans, photos, and a section where people could submit their own memories of Benny, the war, or dogs like Champ. Stories poured in. One woman from Arizona said her father had served with Benny briefly and always said there was one man who kept a journal and traveled with a dog smarter than any person he knew. Another man from Michigan recalled a radio operator who mentioned a silent, four-legged courier that carried messages in the field. The legend was spreading, but in a good way, not distorted, just amplified. And Champ? Still guiding. One morning, he led me behind the feed store, where the ground was uneven and soggy from runoff. He stopped near a half-buried board and pawed at it gently. Underneath, we found a rusted tin, this time filled with marbles, string, and a folded note in a child's handwriting. Benny says to hide this for when the dog comes back. There was no date, no name, just the quiet echo of a promise that had waited decades to be fulfilled. And Champ had kept it. There was still more ahead. We all felt it, but every trail now felt like it belonged to more than just us. We weren't just uncovering Benny's story. We were living inside it. And Champ, as always, was the first to step forward. February came in with a hush. The snow no longer howled. It whispered. The whole town seemed to slow to match its rhythm. Stores opened later. People lingered longer in conversation. And Champ, our guide, our reminder, walked a little less each day, still with purpose, but more selective now, as if the trails he chose were the ones he needed us to remember. One morning, I found him already waiting by the porch steps, ears perked, tail still. I opened the door, expecting the usual slow trot down Main Street, but he turned the other way, toward the old rail line that ran out past the edge of town. Walter joined us just before the tracks, bundled in his thick coat, silent but steady. Tom met us further down the line, near the spot where Benny had once hidden the microfilm. We followed Champ without a word as he weaved across frozen soil and snow-crushed grass, his paws leaving neat impressions that seemed to point at something only he could see. He stopped where the rails curved and the trees thinned. There was nothing visibly different about the spot. No markers, no debris, just a space between past and present. Champ sat down slowly and looked up at me. We dug where he pawed, not deep, just a few inches beneath the frozen topsoil. What we found was small, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine. Inside, a single page and a weathered key. The note was short. It was Benny's handwriting. Some things are locked away not to hide them, but to keep them safe until we're ready. When the stories are known, when the silence has been broken, the rest belongs to the living. Attached to the key was a tag. Ellis. Safe deposit. 231. Tom looked up slowly. That's the bank. We went that same day. The local bank manager didn't even ask questions. The name had long been dormant in the system, flagged but never closed. The box was still there, untouched for decades. He handed it over in a private room and stepped outside. The box was heavier than I expected. Inside, there were no photos, no tapes, no military documents. Just one velvet pouch and a sealed envelope. The pouch contained a medal, one we hadn't seen before. Bronze, rounded edges, embossed with the silhouette of a dog. Along the rim, for service above duty. And the letter? If you've come this far, then you understand. I didn't build a legacy, I followed one. Champ was the first, but not the only. He carried what I couldn't. He showed people what they forgot to look for. And if his kind ever returns to the world again, may they be followed, not with orders, but with gratitude. The medal is not for me. It's for the dog, for the pathfinder. We brought the box back to the library and displayed it next to the others. Beneath the medal, a plaque now reads, "Awarded in memory of all silent servants." After that, Champ started staying closer to the store. He'd still go on walks, but shorter now. The post office, the church steps, the corner where Benny used to wait for the bus as a boy. Then came the night I woke to find him not on his blanket, not at my bedside. The back door had nudged open just enough to let him slip out. I threw on my coat and followed his tracks through the fresh snow. I found him in the park, curled beside the memorial stone bearing Benny's name. He lifted his head when I approached and wagged once, just once, then laid it down again. I sat next to him, didn't speak, just placed a hand on his back, feeling the warmth there, the breath rising and falling. I must have dozed off. The morning sun was climbing by the time I woke, birds singing low in the trees. The town just beginning to stir. Champ was still beside me, but he wasn't breathing. His body was warm, peaceful, eyes closed like they always were when he napped in the sun. One paw rested against the stone, as if saying, "This is where I stop." I didn't cry right away. I carried him home first. Wrapped him in my old army blanket. Walter came by within the hour, no questions, just stood beside me. Tom followed, then others. A dozen people gathered outside the store as word spread. We buried him on the trail behind the lake. The path he had walked again and again, a quiet space where wind carried through the trees and snow muffled the world to stillness. We laid a simple stone. Champ, the one who remembered. A week passed, then two. The town moved forward, slower now, but never backward. The exhibit at the library grew. People brought more than memories. They brought artifacts, dog tags, journals, pins, medals, letters from other soldiers, photos of dogs who had carried them through darkness. Some were veterans, some were grandchildren. All of them understood what Champ had given us. The Department of Defense sent a formal delegation. They requested copies of every file, asked for interviews. They promised a National Archive inclusion, said Champ's trail would live on as part of military history, public and permanent. One night, as snow fell quietly again, I sat in my shop with Benny's medal in my hands, and I said aloud to no one, "He came back. He brought it all home." A boy walked past the window just then, hand in his father's, pointing at the picture of Champ in the window. "That's the dog from the story," he said. The father nodded. "He's the one who never forgot." And just like that, I knew. The story wasn't ours to end. It never was. It belonged to every step that came next, to every small town, every old soldier, every quiet walker of trails. It belonged to the silence, and to those who broke it. And most of all, it belonged to one shaggy, brown dog who carried a medal not for himself, but for what it meant to find the way home. So we let him rest, and we kept walking.